Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm Sam. Thanks to UNSW Galleries for inviting Nella and I to do this little conversation.
Hi, my name is Nella, and yes, thank you also from me for having us. It's nice that we get to somehow be part of the exhibition, even though we're really far away at the moment.
So we are sitting at Obsidian Coast, which is a project space that we run together, which is also our home. The reason we are not together and on two separate Zooms right now is because we are self-isolating. So we are literally 10 meters apart in the same house, but on separate computers to do this little chat.
Yeah. Also something to say, so Obsidian Coast and us right now is located in the southwest region of England in the UK. So we're in the English countryside as we speak. And we are going to talk about Sam's exhibition Capture at UNSW Galleries, just talking about the works in the show, ranging from 2013 to this year, 2021. The oldest work in the show is reflex compositions, and then there's also form variations, the horizontal window, notes, kind of restructuring of this performance work as a multi-channel installation that's being kind of purpose-built for the galleries. And then finally the new commission Capture, which also gives the exhibition its title.
Yeah, so I think we'll kind of talk through pretty much most of the works in some kind of detail as we go along. But first, to say that the show was designed in a way where it kind of starts and ends with a mirror. And what I mean by that is, so both reflex compositions and Capture feature a video camera, or in the case of reflex compositions, a film camera, positioned in front of a mirror so that it's kind of capturing its own image. So in that way, the exhibition and this kind of goes in the way that the galleries are laid out. So it's the very first thing that you see is reflex compositions, and the kind of end point of the exhibition is Capture. So there's quite literally a mirror kind of positioned, albeit a kind of virtual screen-based one, but it's positioned at the end and the beginning of the show. And I like this idea that it creates a kind of infinite light loop in a way, like this idea that that light within the show, or even the kind of viewer within the show, would kind of bounce back and forwards between these 2 points and kind of oscillate. And within that oscillation, you kind of pass through the different other works that are in the show. Yeah.
Yeah, that's nice. So in a way, you were saying before that the exhibition kind of folds in on itself and also then becomes this kind of infinite infinite kind of loop where you could just endlessly bounce back and forth.
Yeah, I don't know, it's got a name. I think this mirror room potentially that has kind of this infinite thing. I always think of like maybe being in like a hotel bathroom or something like that, with this kind of or like a nightclub bathroom or some kind of situation where you are kind of confronted with mirrors on both sides of the room. So that's the kind of
yeah. Changing rooms.
Yeah. Yeah. True. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been quite a shift, or kind of like a steady trajectory in how your work's developed over the years. There's still very much things in common, and there's a kind of, well, I should say maybe common ground or some kind of a thread that weaves through everything, but there's something that has also quite dramatically shifted over the years, and maybe it's nice to talk about that first. I brought this up earlier, this idea of how the portrayal of modernism or modernist ideas and visions as this kind of, I guess, visionary idea of the future, where all problems have been resolved by this rational human, rational creative human, how that kind of modernist framework has taken quite a shift, and also this idea of the modernist man, and how that kind of figure features in the work or is perhaps addressed somehow. That's changed quite drastically in the last 5 years or so. And maybe it would be nice to kind of think about the presence of modernist ideals and perhaps their gradual almost disintegration as the body of work that we see in UNSW Galleries kind of unfolds.
Yeah, I think it's a nice point to make, and I think maybe it's something that possibly I haven't been so kind of conscious of happening. I guess it takes the kind of outsider eye, perhaps, which is really nice. But maybe the easiest way that I can think about talking about it is maybe to think of we'll talk through some kind of concrete examples. So the kind of second, the kind of next two works that you would encounter in the exhibition are Notes and The Horizontal Window. So The Horizontal Window is a work from 2016, which is projected onto a kind of custom screen, which is a combination of two different cinematic ratios, which is the kind of CinemaScope 2.39 ratio, and then the smaller 4:3 Academy film ratio. So it kind of forms this kind of cross pattern or cross-shaped screen. And that work looks at also the architecture of Le Corbusier, and specifically there's one house on the edge of Lake Geneva, which itself has these kind of two cinematic ratios, not exactly, but kind of mimics the kind of binary of these two cinematic ratios within the kind of architecture of the house. So there's a really long strip window, which is the kind of primary window, the kind of, I guess, the kind of primary focus point of the architecture, this long window which gives you a view of the lake and the mountains behind.
Isn't that also the kind of key feature that the house is famous for, this really long window?
Yeah, exactly. And this idea of, again, I guess, thinking through the kind of history of modernism, as you were talking about, but they're kind of linking it to the kind of technological advances, I guess, and this shift to this kind of possibility of larger panes of glass and kind of different construction methods with concrete and these kind of building materials that allowed kind of advances in the kind of, yeah, architectural world. But then it's paired with, in the garden outside, there's quite interestingly, there's like, instead of the garden just being kind of like on the water, there's a wall that kind of blocks part of it. And within this wall is cut like a smaller ratio window, like just in the brick, unglazed. But so yeah, so it has again these kind of two different windows. And I think at the time, and this, as you mentioned, is something which I, have come to realize or to find being problematic, or something which has been a kind of gradual shift away from, is the kind of idea of, or the modernist idea of controlling the gaze over the environment, perhaps, and especially then the kind of white male gaze. Yeah, so Le Corbusier, through the process of the work, I guess I through reading, I, you know, perhaps, well, not perhaps, I found him to be quite a detestable, loathsome, horrible person, which led then to a work called E1027, which we worked on together, Nella and I. Worked on the script and research together, which is a performance work. So it sits within a kind of series of performance works, desktop performance works that I have done. It's the most recent one that I've done. And it takes a kind of a history of Eileen Gray and specifically Eileen Gray's house E1027, which has a kind of shared history, I guess, or a kind of complicated history. Le Corbusier makes it complicated, let's say, through his arrogant interventions, through his kind of egotistical personality and a kind of desire to claim the house as his own, which he does so through the act of vandalism in terms of painting these graphic murals onto the walls of the house after Eileen has left, painting them totally naked in this kind of act as, you know, like a kind of like a dog pissing on a wall, basically, this kind of claiming of ownership, I think. So anyway, so yeah, so E1027 is not is folded into the show, as Nella mentioned, in this new piece called Notes. So Notes is a kind of large scale 3-channel projection of all of the performance works kind of remixed or mixed together. So portions from 4 different performance works that I had made since 2013, reconfigured to this top-down, so 3 projections projecting from the roof onto the nearest to the floor with a series of kind of large table structures, a kind of topographical projection surface, which serves as a kind of platform for multiple clips and audio and images to be presented in a kind of collaged series of vignettes, which draw from all the different performances. So across a lot of territory in terms of cinema history, glass manufacture, and then kind of like I guess thinking about these clips and this archive as a kind of organically living archive. So it develops over time, and so the sections of this configuration where this kind of organic clips play as a kind of reference point to that. Yeah, that was a long tangent from your question, but yeah, I really think it's interesting, this idea of highlighting the shift away from the modernist kind of viewpoint.
Yeah, I think maybe just going back to the horizontal window and E1027 a little bit. So you mentioned Eileen Gray, who's designed this house E1027 in the south of France. So Eileen Gray is an Irish architect who was a kind of contemporary of Le Corbusier, in a kind of high point of modernist architecture, if you will. And it's interesting how, even though they both kind of sit within that peak of that type of architectural innovation at the same time, the approaches are very, very different. And there's this, the kind of the masculine discipline and this kind of quite interrogating gaze that comes across in Le Corbusier, as opposed to then this kind of more flowing approach that's somehow more accepting of these kind of natural flows of wind and light, and in a slightly different way, but perhaps a softer approach, also thinking about the intimacies of the everyday living in the house. So they're very different approaches when we talk about modernism in terms of architecture. Obviously, there are big nuances in how different architects have talked about their work, but there's perhaps, yeah, the shift that's happened there is that with the horizontal window, the kind of masculine modernist ideals, they're treated with quite sort of like attentive, caring, admiring touch even. This idea of these kind of innovations being, I guess, the technological development that you're talking about, and these ideas of framing and somehow managing views of landscape. There's something, there's like, there's intrigue, and there's some kind of softness with which you kind of explore that. And then it's quite a shift when you then move on to kind of looking at the interactions of these two architects. And that kind of, it's funny that this Le Corbusier kind of figure becomes almost this kind of iconic figure of the kind of quintessential modernist man, and how then there's this kind of whole dramatic unfolding of his sort of obsession with this house that he couldn't claim as his, and how he ended up sort of dying right outside in front of that house. That's where he spent the last seconds of his life, looking up on this house that he could never claim. So there's also that kind of, it comes very literally in these two works, this idea of this kind of, this figure kind of sinking into the bottom of the sea somehow. I don't know if that's a weird thing to say, but then, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think maybe it's worth mentioning also that, so there's the script for E1027 that we wrote together, I think takes that narrative and then imagines a future for it. So whereas it's talking about Le Corbusier and Eileen Gray, I think the kind of central character of that work and the script that we wrote is the house. So, and the house being, considering itself, I think, part of the landscape and part of its environment in a way that at least Le Corbusier's architecture is kind of sets out maybe to be a more of a kind of commanding over kind of statement. So the kind of shift away from the human, I think, is something which as well is something which has maybe been a kind of general shift in my work in the last few years or so. And so and maybe another thing to mention is then, yeah, this idea of the kind of deep time that, or the kind of temporal nature that is kind of available to think about when you kind of shift away from a human-centric kind of viewpoint. If you think through materials that exist for longer periods of time, then it kind of opens up, as we were thinking at the time, you know, that opens up ways in which to think through these longer time scales and the kind of critical areas, I guess, that it opens when you think in that way, or when you kind of open that door.
Yeah. Also, maybe something to say about the horizontal window is that even though there is that kind of attention to this kind of some sort of creative genius, although that's obviously a debatable notion in itself. But then at the same time, there is this idea of glass that's very present there, as a kind of some kind of a lively element, that comes and goes in different forms. But there's also these shots of water moving, which is kind of reminiscent of this kind of, you know, kind of translucent but kind of thick substance that somehow kind of interacts with light, that then is therefore kind of reminiscent of glass. And there is this kind of overall this kind of almost ominous kind of presence of this glass that's somehow lively and not quite under human control in a way that it might appear when it's kind of stuck as a pane of glass within a frame through which a person can look. So there's also that kind of uneasiness there already, a hint of something other, something where the control of this human creativity over other matter is already kind of put into question a little bit. So there's a kind of nod towards that, but maybe it's more of a kind of underlying hint than something that you would kind of spell out necessarily in that work.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, the idea of materials being passive, I guess, in that kind of claiming, or the kind of architectural way is something that, yeah, exactly, I was wanting to kind of imbue into the work as being like not true, you know, that the materials are active in the kind of formation of, if Le Corbusier is talking about, or, you know, an architect is talking about a window creating a kind of vista and an image, in a similar way to a video camera or film camera making an image. The glass is doing, the art glass is literally, you know, transmitting and transforming light and bending light and creating imperfections, and that kind of personality of the glass is kind of transcribed onto the image that comes afterwards.
Maybe one more thing to say about glass before we move on. When we think about the character of glass, or glass is something that has character, you often don't really think about it so much when you come across these mass-produced perfect windows, for instance, that are meant to be these, they're meant to be so perfect that it's almost as if they're not there. But then when you see, for example, you see old windows where there are wobbles and kind of weird rounded shapes and air bubbles and things, there's definitely that kind of character. And I've never really consciously looked through that kind of window, but when I see those from outside, I always think what the view must look from inside to look out. That's like probably quite a lot of distortion.
I think it's nice what you mentioned before about the ripples on the lake. It makes me think of the same thing. Yeah, and maybe, yeah, this idea of, because glass, I think I'm correct in thinking it's basically it's not a solid and it's not a liquid, so it is technically moving. It's just moving very slowly, so it is kind of rippling in time, but just really, really, really slowly. So I think, yeah, this idea of likening it to the kind of ripples on a lake is nice, because it's similar. It's just that the temporal kind of nature has been stretched so far that the ripples are just really slow. This kind of idea of the viscosity of it is so thick and gooey that it's really, really slow moving. Yeah, so maybe that's a nice segue to thinking about the kind of temporal elements within form variations.
Yeah, there's You said earlier that it's the it's the work that you've made that kind of most actively thinks about the kind of aliveness of things, other than perhaps biologically deemed live things. Um, and also, yeah, there are lots of different kinds of temporalities and rhythms that unfold in it. Maybe, yeah, we could talk about the time things first.
Yeah. Maybe I could start. So, okay, so maybe in a basic sense, we can say that the work is a loop. So the work doesn't necessarily have a beginning and an end. Kind of loops in a function in a way that it kind of functions to return to certain motifs and certain scenes and certain objects, and uses different kind of markers of time within the frame, within the soundtrack, to kind of reinforce this kind of idea of the kind of temporality or the kind of time passing, but then also reinforce the, I guess, the kind of experience of the viewer watching the work into this kind of idea of it looping back and forwards or back around again.
So the exhibition is an ideal scenario for that kind of work to be shown, because you could technically just sit there endlessly seeing it over and over again, and you might arrive at it at any possible point when you come into the show.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like in a way it doesn't, its scenes and its shots aren't in any way linear, that they're a kind of more of a collection, a web of things that have been strung together in a linear fashion, because that's the constraints of, you know, a single channel film work. But in a kind of conceptual way, or the way that I feel about them when I was editing them together, is that they're kind of more dispersed rhizomatically perhaps, and you could kind of pick from one to the other in any kind of way, and the work would still be the work. So that the shots themselves kind of replicate or reference the ways in which I think the objects within the shots kind of operate, which is this kind of set of kind of infinite relationships between the things that are within the shots. So the shots themselves, yeah, again, kind of like these layers of relationships that are kind of interwoven and webbed together.
So what we see in the work is basically an apartment of some description. It's quite sort of nondescript in terms of where it might be, when it might be. It's quite ambiguous, and there are arrangements of things, one of whom is a human being.
Yeah, I think exactly. I think that the human being is just another object in the space, I guess. And the space itself is the offices of an old 1930s film studio in Berlin. So it was filmed in the kind of one of the sound stages of the film studio, and in the offices, which are now kind of, yeah, used primarily not as offices, but as also kind of locations for the kind of architecture of the time, I guess. Yeah. And the other thing that we mentioned earlier today when we were kind of talking a little bit was the presence of the metronome within the work, that you brought up.
There was something nice about that kind of, yeah, an indication of time passing, but because they are basically these kind of perpetual motion devices, that you know that when you kind of set a certain pace or a rhythm, it just goes on indefinitely. So it doesn't really mark any sort of duration necessarily. It's just the kind of marking of a rhythm or repetition or something like that. So I guess that kind of goes with this idea of an infinite loop again, which is basically how the work operates.
Yeah.
As a whole.
Yeah, and then I think what's nice about thinking of this kind of the metronome kind of setting this pace, perhaps, and the idea of the loop kind of falling or falling on top of that, or kind of falling within that pace. That then the loop, I think, the loop is not fixed. You know, the loop, it's not a kind of obvious or not a exact replication every time the loop comes around. I think because the loop is maybe being built within the kind of viewer's experience of the work, and that experience is shifting. Maybe different viewers as well. It's a kind of idea of that. Yeah, maybe it's just important to note that a loop is not a loop. Doesn't there is no perfect loop that exists, I guess. And that's something which I like, the idea that it kind of gets reinforced by this kind of continual perpetual motion of the metronome, which is a marker of temporality, but almost kind of atemporal in its kind of eternal nature in some way.
Where did you kind of come across these different, there's like a number of props that are placed in different ways throughout. There are different shots of these things being arranged, or they are already an arrangement or an assemblage of things, and then you just kind of see these things shifting in different kinds of, or into different kinds of relations with each other. How did you come across those props, or how did you choose that they would be those particular types of things that you wanted to include?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things. So one reference point was, so the work includes within it a recreation of a scene from an Antonioni film called The Eclipse, or L'Eclisse, in which, and it shows a kind of multiple versions of this one shot, and it's the opening of the film, which has a kind of holds within it some of these same ideas. There's like the first 5 minutes of the film, there is no dialogue, but there are these two people in an apartment, and they kind of assume different positions and forms, and interact with again this kind of the human and the objects being kind of on a level playing field. And there's one other shot of Monica Vitti, who's in that scene, picking these small objects which are on a desk and repositioning them in relation to a frame. So it was kind of a continuation, I guess, of that, and the idea of objects that are potentially human-made objects as well. Like a lot of them are small sculptures, some of which I made myself, some of which were found, objects from flea markets, vases, small kind of ceramics. So I think, and then geometric shapes as well. There's some spheres, these kind of rectangular blocks. So I think yeah, it's a good question. I think they're somehow maybe stand-ins for kind of familiar objects. I think there's something about the kind of scale potentially as a kind of objects that a human hand might find, I don't know, some kind of relationship with. Yeah.
There's something that it made me think about. There's this one shot which pans across a room, and you get these different kind of sculptural shapes, and then you get the kind of, they're all suspended somehow, or not suspended actually, they're supported from below, so they're resting on something rather. And then amongst those you get a kind of bust of a human figure. So suddenly that becomes a very sort of object like thing in itself, this idea of the kind of shoulders that support this head that's balanced in the center. And then at the same time you see this kind of more abstracted kind of irregular shape that suddenly seems to become quite face-like as it as the camera pans past it. And then there's something also in these shots with this again, I'm stuck with this human, even though what I'm trying to say is that I shouldn't be stuck with the human in a way, because what I'm getting at is that there are these kind of moments when it's just, you know, normally there's this idea that the human is in the background, no, in the foreground, and everything else is in the background, supporting the kind of human presence for some sort of action, or to give the context some kind of to give the action some kind of context rather. But here the human is equally sort of part of the background. So there isn't the foreground, there isn't a background, there isn't some kind of priority of things or a hierarchy of things according to which you're meant to look at a particular thing at any specific time. And I thought that was quite powerful. And then also the kind of, there are these moments where you see this human figure again without a head, or you see an arm without the rest of the body. So that also kind of further, in a way, perhaps somehow blurs the boundary between this kind of human body and an object. And that might sound a little worrisome, perhaps, that a human body would become somehow more object-like and it can just be dismembered as you wish. But then at the same time, there is this kind of elevation of all these other things that are in themselves becoming more lively. But then, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily want to dip into this whole kind of flat ontologies, we're all material, we're all the same, because it's not the case. But there's a kind of interesting inquiry into those kinds of balances of attention and where we are kind of drawn to and what we value, perhaps in a very kind of abstract, unspoken way, but it kind of teases a lot of those things out. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you mentioned there, I think, is really important. The kind of yeah, the goal is not a kind of flattening, but maybe, yeah, as you say, like a reshifting of the potential ways to look at things, or the ways to be with things as well. Yeah, that's a good point.
I feel like that might be a way to segue into capture, which is also dealing with these kinds of questions, and I think is perhaps then more acutely aware of the kind of also the politics of kind of materiality, even if it's not necessarily spelled out, but the kinds of I guess yeah, hierarchies of different kinds of material beings, and how they are seen or used or not used, harnessed, purposed, however you might look at it. Yeah, do you want to kind of introduce?
So capture, as Nella mentioned at the beginning, is a new commission, which kind of premiered in this exhibition. So it's a 2-channel film, 2-channel video work, and it's been there was a long process of making it. It kind of came about as an idea in 2019, following a kind of, I guess, this, what's the right word? Or basically a kind of a desire to understand on quite a fundamental level what it means as a practitioner who uses a video camera. So after, as we've kind of touched on, maybe after some years thinking about the language of cinema and the language of a camera and how the kind of frames and how images are produced, to focus kind of more practically and kind of more fundamentally on the idea of like how a video camera can make an image and what that means and what it means to assemble this kind of technological object called a video camera. So the idea behind it then was to basically pull apart a video camera and subject it to a series of scientific lab analysis, which in this case, so I was very fortunate to work with the Mark Wainwright Analytical Center, which is at UNSW, who performed a whole series of scientific tests on this video camera, which is a Blackmagic cinema camera, 2.5K, which was pulled apart, and through that analysis, they were able to map on a kind of elemental level, like a kind of geological survey of this object. So thinking about what minerals, what elements are inside the object, and make it function, make it what it is. And they found 74 different elements within the camera, which is 63% of the periodic table. So it's a huge portion of what makes up the planet Earth, are present and accounted for within this small object that is assembled by humans. So the work starts with, as I mentioned before, starts with this mirror footage of the camera being dismantled, and filming itself as it's being dismantled, and progresses through kind of documentation of the lab process, and then intersperses that with a piece of writing, a text written by Himali Singh Soin, which kind of teases out some of the more poetic kind of threads that are within this process and within kind of relationship that the camera has to us, and maybe also has to the to the materials that are within it.
Yeah, I think it's kind of, yeah, it's interesting. It kind of felt weird to kind of dive into this whole modernism thing in the beginning, but when you talk about that, it kind of, in a way, kind of closes a circle to produce another loop. That, in a sense, there is again this kind of some kind of human technological innovation. And again, we come to this idea of the kind of framing device, but then rather than it being this kind of perhaps a glorification or some kind of celebration of that innovation, it perhaps calls into question also the cost of what it means to have that kind of a device, and the kind of consequences of its production or the conditions of its production. It kind of opens up a whole lot of inquiries of where all these materials that are embedded to planet Earth, where they come from, who gets them, how they are refined into something that becomes a functional kind of object with which to create something. But then, yeah, there's this kind of, at the same time, there is this very serious kind of dedication to and kind of fascination with the camera, which is present in all of your works always. So there's this kind of perhaps an acknowledgement that the camera is not an innocent thing as a tool that you have to use if you wish to be an artist who produces moving images. But then at the same time, it's not something that that you then should throw away, because at the end of the day, none of the things that we use in our daily lives, I mean, we're on our computers right now, and they're equally complicated objects to the camera that you took apart. So there's something about the kind of working with the non-innocent object and kind of understanding its context and the consequences of its existence, perhaps.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess you've talked to me before potentially about the idea of non-innocent bonds, and that yeah, I guess acknowledging that by picking up this camera, that kind of you're entering into a kind of non-innocent relationship with that object that will be affecting countless other things and objects. Yeah, I think the process was entered into with without any knowledge of, I guess with a kind of inkling that maybe most people would have, that there will be certain elements within this camera, that there will be rare earth minerals, that there will be precious metals, that there will be, certain elements that we all might kind of know are going to be there. But what I think was the thing that I didn't anticipate necessarily was the kind of complexity and the number of elements that were going to show up. And the idea that there's one object could be such a representation of what's found within kind of geologically or elementally what's kind of found on this planet, that it can be almost, that it's more than 50%, that it's, that its footprint is so large in a way. And that complexity was something which took me by surprise, I think, for sure. And that was one of the desires for the work, I think, was to hopefully learn a little bit myself, along the way, and to think a little bit more about what it means personally, to pick up a video camera. And
Yeah,
to kind of,
there is a direct personal connection, right? That you have. So you used to, no, actually, technically, yeah, you use 3 cameras to film the work, and they are all by the same manufacturer. Is that right?
technically, I guess technically I used 4, but I think so. I can explain why Nella says 3. So there are 3 video cameras used and 1 still camera used. So yeah, the 3 that are used are all made by a company called Blackmagic, which was chosen for a number of reasons. Primarily because I've just owned those cameras and I've used those cameras amongst others, but I kind of primarily used those cameras in the last few works that I've made. And the camera that the second-hand camera that I purchased to kind of dismember in this work was a camera that I used to have and did kind of shoot some work on. Also, that they are an Australian company as well, so I think the kind of situating the work and knowing that it was going to premiere in the show in Sydney, it was interesting to me to think about the kind of, yeah, this kind of Melbourne-based company. I think I'm correct in saying Melbourne-based, to kind of use for this project. So yeah, so there are 3 Blackmagic cameras which shoot different parts of the work. The one that shoots itself, the one that shoots the lab, which was filmed remotely. So it was filmed as I couldn't travel myself, filmed by Hikaru Yamatsu, who did a great job in kind of capturing that side of things. And then there's another Blackmagic camera which shoots some kind of exteriors, which was shot in the southwest, quite close to where we are now, of some goats on a mountain and a cave in Cheddar Gorge, which is in the southwest of England. And then the other part of the work, which I guess we haven't quite mentioned yet, is there are these sections which are stop motion, built through kind of stop motion animation techniques of hand painted frames of earth pigments. So basically they're kind of painted one by one using ultramarine, red ochre, yellow ochre, burnt umber, and a selection of others to produce these kind of color field sections as a way to maybe kind of reference or acknowledge the kind of, in a very base level, the kind of elemental earth part of the work. So they are captured with a still camera. So they're kind of sequenced one by one, just through stills. Yeah.
There's also something about the kind of, often when people produce digital images, they feel by default immaterial. And it is it's a digital work, but then there's something about those hand painted film strip like sequences that kind of remind through the kind of film like quality, they remind you of the materiality of every single image that and yeah, it's quite beautiful then that they're also kind of literally painted with the earth.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's something that hopefully is also there, and when you're seeing the camera filming itself with a mirror, that kind of materiality is something which I think kind of crosses through the whole work in all the kind of different sections. And actually something I was thinking about earlier when we were talking about glass, which is a small connection which I hadn't thought about before, which is quite nice. So a portion, quite a large portion of the footage which is showing the lab process is showing the a sample of basically a glass sample. So basically the kind of the surface of the rear LCD screen that's part of the camera was kind of pulled apart, and the glass element, kind of final surface on that, was analyzed separately. So the glass is kind of pulverized into a powder and then melted in these furnaces. And so there's a you know, this kind of small round section of melted glass which is analyzed. So yeah, the kind of transmutability, or the kind of glass is a kind of ungraspable or kind of malleable, shifting chameleon kind of object, I guess, or material. Also sneakily finds its way into capture as well, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, it's kind of nice when you've seen the horizontal window and then you see those little molten little all these kind of cups filled with this kind of molten liquid. Yeah, it really reminds you of the glass blower who's pouring from this kind of big ladle, and that is, you know, glowing with heat. It's got a very similar energy.
Yeah,
nice to see these like years apart, and also that you weren't actually in the lab yourself physically, so you had to kind of trust that process to someone else, yet they somehow caught that. They were able to kind of capture that moment for you there as well. So yeah, it's almost like the glass is making itself appear for you in that kind of molten sneaky form.
Yeah, and obviously then, you know, going back to this idea of the mirror, obviously again a piece of glass. Yeah, it's probably quite a yeah, if not the most, maybe we might have figured out what's the most prevalent material within my work in the last 10 years or so. Yeah, perhaps, is that a good point to wrap up on? Or
yeah, maybe. I feel like we've maybe closed another loop.
Yeah. It's true. It's all about loops.
Yeah, it's all about loops. Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing.
Thanks for talking to me via a screen in proximity, but somehow removed.
Yeah. Kind of like the work capture. Yeah.
True.
The condition.
Yeah, and thanks again to Jose and everyone at UNSW Galleries for the exhibition, and also for inviting us for this small chat. If you made it this far, thanks for watching all the way through. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye.